Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hey everyone, I'm Julie Gunlock with the Independent Women's Forum and your host for today's Working for Women podcast. Today I'm here with Jennifer Braceras, who's a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. She's also a political columnist and a former commissioner of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Jennifer graduated from Harvard Law School in 1994, and she went on to practice labor and employment law. She's taught classes on civil rights and constitutional law at both Boston College Law School and Suffolk University Law School. Jennifer also served, this is very cool, Jennifer also served as a staff assistant to Vice President Dan Quayle. As a columnist, Jennifer often writes about law, politics, and culture, and specifically focuses on education, Title IX, media bias, and the politics of judicial nominations and confirmations, which is weird. I can't imagine there being any politics involved in that, Jennifer. But anyway, her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, National Review Online, the Boston Globe, the Boston Herald, the Washington Times, and the Weekly Standard. And on top of all of that, she lives in Boston with her husband and 4 children, which is very impressive. So, Jennifer, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
So today we're going to be talking about the opioid crisis in America, significant crisis currently going on in America. And then more specifically, Jennifer and I are going to be talking about the lawsuits that have been filed against pharmaceutical companies by cities, counties, states, and Native American tribes, and now possibly the federal government. The lawsuits essentially have been filed against these pharmaceutical companies based on the theory that they are responsible for the opioid crisis entirely. So Jennifer and I will get into that. So Jennifer, I do want to talk. I want to get into the nitty gritty about the lawsuits. But first, and I don't think people live under a rock or don't understand that this opioid crisis is going on. But I think one thing that's really important when you talk about the lawsuits and when you talk about sort of legal action against these companies is understanding just what a big problem this really is in the country. And that's, I think, really just important because it is, I think the word crisis is the right word to use. So if you could give listeners just an idea of, how big this crisis is and how difficult it really is to solve.
I do think that's right, Julie. I think almost everybody you talk to knows somebody who's been affected by this in one way or another. And that, sort of is the tipping point for me, right? When everyone
right.
you meet knows somebody who struggled with addiction to opioids or even knows somebody who's overdosed on them or passed away from an overdose, you have a real crisis on your hands.
Yeah.
So it is a problem, and, communities are struggling with it all across the country. But I think the issue is, how do we solve it? Not how do governments and plaintiffs' lawyers get rich off it, right? We should be
right.
focusing on how to help people.
Well, that's a good segue into these lawsuits because but we're talking hundreds of lawsuits now that have been filed against pharmaceutical companies. Give our listeners an overview of that. And I want to be clear here too. We're gonna talk about this briefly, but Jennifer has written extensively on this. All of her writing can be found at IWF.org. Jennifer, you've written a legal brief on this. You recently wrote an op-ed for National Review Online. Give us an overview of the lawsuits, and then first just the lawsuits themselves that have been filed, and sort of the strategy that's being employed, and then after that we can talk about Trump's recent comments.
Sure. So there are, by the most recent estimation, at least 1,000 lawsuits
wow.
currently filed against various pharmaceutical companies, as well as the distributors of these legal pain medications. And the lawsuits are filed primarily by government entities, so counties, cities, towns, state governments, and the lawsuits are seeking billions of dollars in damages and money. So the governments are essentially saying that the pharmaceutical companies owe them billions of dollars to pay for the costs of law enforcement, prisons, healthcare, addiction treatment, the whole gamut of social services that they say they've had to spend more money on since the opioid epidemic broke.
Right. So tell me a little bit about what you've written in your legal brief about why this is a violation of it brings up constitutional issues and certainly legal issues. But tell us a little bit why you think these lawsuits really aren't a good idea. It's not a good path to go down.
So the main point is that these are civil suits and they're seeking huge financial payouts. And essentially from, a constitutional and public policy perspective, government shouldn't be getting money from the private sector unless they're taxing the private sector, right? Typically the way it works is if the government needs more money, they raise taxes on individuals or corporations, and those are decisions that are democratically enacted, and that the politicians have to face the voters afterwards. And if people agree that taxes should be raised, then fine, and if they don't, there might be political repercussions. This is using the legal system to raise money, essentially, to pay for government services, many of which they would have to pay anyway. So, for example, they have to pay the salary of the chief of police and all of the officers who work for the police department, regardless of whether those officers are focusing on opioids or whether they're focusing on, gang violence or whether they're focusing on whatever, burglaries, right? Those costs remain even. So why should Purdue Pharma have to pay the city of Boston to reimburse them for the cost of law enforcement?
It's interesting. You call it, in your op-ed in National Review, you call it extortion, you call it sort of a shakedown, and I think that's very valid because one of the things, and you mentioned in your piece as well, that many of these cities and states have hired the same companies or the same law firms that sued the tobacco companies. And that's really what we're seeing here, right? We're seeing a lot of these cities and towns, rather cities and counties, looking for that tobacco-style payout, right? They're using that playbook.
So this has become a cottage industry of plaintiffs' lawyers who hire themselves out to government. So here you have your tax dollars at work paying for, these lawyers, their base costs, and then they're going to get hugely rich off these settlements from these lawsuits. The thing about it is that legally they don't really have a very strong case. And even in the tobacco cases, which were much stronger than the opioid cases, but we can get into that in a minute. Even in the tobacco cases, no court ever held that Philip Morris and the other tobacco companies were legally liable to the states. What happened was, and the reason I call it extortion, is that these lawyers and these governments made it so expensive and so chaotic to fight these lawsuits in hundreds of jurisdictions, in state courts, in federal courts, all over the country, that they basically made the cost of litigation so expensive that the companies settled it to put a stop to it. So the lawsuits themselves became a nuisance. And that's what's happening in the opioid cases. Hundreds of these cases are consolidated before a single judge in Ohio. And that judge has said very explicitly, I don't ever expect these cases to go to trial. These cases are a tool for extracting a settlement from the pharmaceutical companies. Now, if that's not extortion, I don't know what is.
Right, exactly. And what's so sad, too, is, and it's really interesting because they're using the tobacco playbook, and yet it's not tobacco we're talking about. Cigarette companies produce things that have cigarette companies produce combustible cigarettes, which have absolutely no health benefits. These things do nothing but combustible cigarettes, traditional combustible cigarettes do nothing but kill people. There's no benefit to them. Whereas pharmaceutical companies actually do produce things, vaccines, pain medications like opioids. Opioids do what's lost in this, I think, is you've got this idea that opioids are just bad. Well, they're not. I mean, they're cancer patients who can live, can still work, can still live productive lives while they're getting cancer treatments because they're using some opioids that help them with the pain. I mean, people get in car accidents and have to live with chronic pain for the rest of their lives, and opioids really help them. So that's also frustrating. And just one question about the tobacco lawsuit, the firms. Am I right in that the tobacco payouts, very little of that actually went to help, people stop smoking, or cancer patients, or people who were harmed by tobacco or by cigarettes? I hate to say tobacco, but cigarettes. Isn't that true? It was just a big money maker.
There's so much to unpack there in what you just said, but to answer that your precise question, a very, very, very small percentage of the billions of dollars that the tobacco companies paid to the states went to prevention and smoking, health-related things. Most of it went entirely to plug budget shortfalls and basically just went into the general operating budget of the state to pay for regular government services.
Right, and billions went to billions went to lawyers, and
billions went to lawyers. And the other thing is that these tobacco settlements, the states have become dependent on that as a source of income. So in budgeting, those payments, which have been made over the course of many years, they've come to count on them. And now that they're starting to run out, a lot of these jurisdictions are trying to find ways to make up that money. That's why they're going after the pharmaceutical companies, because they need another stream of income.
Yeah, we're seeing this also. I don't want to get into this issue, but we're also seeing this on the climate change issue. We have a lot of cities and states that are suing oil companies, claiming that they alone are to blame for climate change. It's absurd, of course, but we're seeing this type of lawsuit being used again as a new revenue stream. And look, you're right that they became dependent on, for instance, tobacco money, and now that's running out, and so they are looking for these other streams. Let's talk really quickly about what President Trump recently said about these lawsuits. He sort of he suggested they might actually sue. Isn't that correct?
He did, yeah. He's been hinting at it for a while, and in a recent cabinet meeting, he directed Attorney General Sessions to file a federal civil case against the pharmaceutical companies, similar to the ones that have already been filed by, the hundreds and hundreds of cities and counties and states. So basically just jumping on the bandwagon and I guess seeing if the federal government can get a piece of the pie.
Now, I think this is my last question, but I do want to talk about sort of this whole idea of blaming one entity, that is the opioid, the pharmaceutical companies, on the opioid crisis. What is the basis of that charge?
So the legal argument in most of these types of cases, whether it's pharmaceuticals, tobacco, big oil, any of these things, the standard claim is public nuisance. And the argument there is that whomever they're suing created a public nuisance, and that's against the law. Now, public nuisance law wasn't invented for this purpose. It's not typically used for this purpose. The usual public nuisance case is, let's say you have a company who's polluting the drinking water of a community, right? That causes a public nuisance because it affects everyone in the community, not just some people, but any single person who turns on the tap. And in those cases, the government could bring a suit to stop the company from polluting and to get them to clean it up, right? Yeah. They wouldn't be suing them to pay for, the cost of running the government. They wouldn't be seeking a financial income stream off it. They would just be suing for them to, essentially cease and desist and clean up your mess. So that legal doctrine isn't really applicable to pharmaceutical companies But again, as I said earlier, whether or not the cases have legal merit is not really the point. The point is to kick up enough dust, make life complicated enough and expensive enough for the pharmaceutical companies that they cave.
Right. Wow. Jennifer, you have been such a helpful guest on this podcast just to explain this issue. It's a really complicated issue, and it's a tough issue because, again, I think obviously everybody sympathizes and, like you said, maybe even knows someone who's had a problem with opioids, and so it is a really important issue. But again, these lawsuits are not the way to solve the problem, and I think the work that you're doing is really helpful in shedding light on this sort of lawsuit abuse. So thanks so much for joining me.
No problem, Julie. It's great to talk to you.
Well, this has been another edition of IWF's Working for Women podcast. And for those who listen, thank you for your time. Please come and learn more and consider making a donation to support our work at IWF.org. Thank you.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by IWF.org for similar content.